Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in sunny Southern California in Santa Monica at the RAND Corporation, the think tank that's on one of America's preeminent think tanks that's headquartered out here in California. And we're talking to Jennie Wenger, who is a senior economist here at RAND, who looks at military personnel issues, recruiting issues, and you've been looking at social media as well as cyber. So we appreciate you taking some time on this horrible day to talk to us.
Thank you. I'm happy to talk with you.
Let me ask you first about social media trends in recruiting. Talk to us about some of the data that you're finding. You know, you were saying that when there's a spike in social media on Army recruiting, for example, you find more people go and try to join the United States Army, which from the Army's perspective is a positive thing. Talk to us a little bit about some of the trends you see, in social media and how it's driving military recruitment.
Okay, certainly. Well, social media means a number of different things. So we could talk about, for instance, specific websites. We could also talk about other platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And the Army uses all of those platforms and websites pretty extensively. Some of the first research that we did in this area used Google search data. Now, we never knew who was searching. The data are completely anonymized. But what we did is we looked at the Google search data and we looked at trends in searching for Army-specific terms. For example, how do I join the Army? And what we did find is when you saw a small spike or a large spike in those types of searches, what you would see is some weeks or months later, more people actually showing up to join the Army. So that's interesting. And what it suggests is that this type of search data gives us another form of information. We already have a fair amount of information about Army recruiting, but this is a form of information that it's hard to get any other way. It's more or less in real time. And by the way, there's been other research, for instance, predicting flu outbreaks that's used similar data, and it's been found to be quite effective when combined, for instance, into the CDC's models. So we're not the only ones who are looking at this, and we think it's pretty effective in a number of different areas. The other thing about this search data, though, is it allows us to understand information that might be hard to understand in other ways. What we find is that people will search for information that they might be embarrassed to ask another person for. For example, they might search for information about qualifications, health standards. They might search for information about, for instance, can I join the Army if I've had a felony or if I have a DUI or something like that. And you can see how people might not want to reveal that type of thing.
Or can I still keep using drugs when I join the Army?
Correct. And the answer is no. I'm not saying the answer to that question is no. But yes, they search for all these different types of information. And so what we get is we get insights into what people are worried about and what they're interested in. And that's very useful information for the Army. Again, we can't say this person over here said that, but what we can say is we see a trend in people asking questions about, for example, legalized marijuana. Maybe we want to make sure recruiters know about that so that they can answer those kinds of questions. Maybe we even want to make changes in the screening process, potentially.
Well, let me ask you, so do we know what triggers, right? Every trend is triggered by something. So do we know what triggers the trend that all of a sudden, how do I join the Army starts trending? Is it because HBO is showing Saving Private Ryan, or Band of Brothers is on, or there's the release of a new game, for example? I mean, do we know what drives these sort of trends? Because the Army may want to harness those to get to sort of, get it to trend, which I'm sure the Army is in the process of weaponizing this information and in its recruiting campaigns in the most positive sense.
Oh, I wouldn't put it that way. No. These are very interesting hypotheses that you put forth. The short answer is we don't know yet, but we've begun to start to explore all of these things. There are any number of different things that could drive an interest in recruiting. It could be, for instance, something that happens in the civilian market. You're right, it could be the popularity of a TV show. For instance, I think it was during the 80s when LA Law was on and the number of law school applicants went up dramatically. That would be something that would be useful for law schools to predict. So the way people respond to a video game or some other Army incident would be very helpful for the Army to predict. And it would be helpful for them also to understand who responds, because the Army and all the services have a wide variety of jobs that they need to fill. They need people with different skill sets. So there's the potential here, for example, to say, are people with cyber skills attracted by this type of ad? Are they attracted by this type of news story? Do we start to see those people hitting the first the Army website and then eventually trying to join the Army? So there's great potential, I think, in using these data. We're getting there, but we're taking baby steps at this point.
Yeah, we should do a couple of like real world experiments and try to get some major motion pictures out there. Let's see if the new World War II destroyer movie that's being produced will show any spike in sort of Navy recruiting. Let's talk about cyber. You mentioned cyber for a second, and it's an interesting career field. Each of the military services has, I don't want to say struggled, but has worked to try to define a group of folks that can come, what standards get waived for them, given that we want, and we're very, very eager for that skill set. At the service chiefs panel discussion yesterday at the West Conference down in San Diego, where we had the Chief of Naval Operations Richardson, Marine Corps Commandant Neller, and Coast Guard Commandant Zukunft. Panel discussion was moderated by Jim Stavridis, and Admiral Stavridis sort of drove home his case why he thought there should be a separate cyber force because, and he playfully sort of joked that he said, and we'll see 30 years from now that I was right, something like that. But there are many people who do think that. But talk to us more specifically about cyber recruiting. What are the triggers to try to get those folks to join the military services? What's the best way to retain them? It's an intellectual bunch that is very, very passionate about what they do, and are less attracted with some of the other attributes of military service, for example, that most people find attractive, which is putting on a big pack, for example. And so talk to us a little bit about the nuances of attracting this community and retaining the community once they're attracted to a military service.
Sure. I'll talk a bit about my research, a bit about the research that others here at RAND have done, and maybe even a little bit about the outside research, because there are a whole bunch of people who are working on these topics. My own research has been focused on the enlisted Army. The enlisted Army is in the process of setting up and expanding its cyber occupations. So what it needs for its cyber occupations on the enlisted side are people who do very well on standardized tests. In general, doing well on standardized tests is a very good predictor of completing training successfully. So far, they appear to have a sufficient number of potential cyber recruits by those measures. Okay, so have fairly high number of enlistees who are coming in, hitting the standardized test requirements. Everything that we've done on cyber suggests that the mission is important. One of the reasons that people join the military to do cyber is because they really want to work on cyber-specific tasks in the military. That mission is fundamentally important to them. So that suggests that it's important to make sure that the military cyber personnel actually spend their time working on cyber as much as possible. And of course, everyone in the military does a variety of jobs, and taking part in the military doesn't just mean doing your occupation, it means being part of a bigger team. But trying to make sure that the cyber personnel spend their time doing cyber appears to be something that's likely going to have very good effects on retention. The other thing that cyber personnel very much seem to value is additional training. So if we can keep on providing training opportunities for people, they're more likely to stay in the organization, and that's completely relevant to the military too. Now, on the cyber side, we're also able to do some work looking at civilian data, looking at the American Community Survey, and because the cyber occupation is precisely defined, we were able to find people in the civilian sector who had not completed college, but who did very specific job tasks that were similar in many ways to what the Army cyber workers do. So we were actually able to compare salaries, therefore. And what we found was that the compensation package that the Army is offering right now is roughly comparable to what somebody would earn on average in the civilian sector. Now, that doesn't mean that the Army won't have retention problems. It's good news from the Army's perspective. It means that they're probably in a position to use the kinds of tools that they typically use to retain people, which would be offering additional training, perhaps bonuses at the retention point. Things that could still be problematic would be, for example, if the people in the civilian sector start to value Army experience in the same way that they value a college degree. That would be problematic from the Army's perspective, because they could start to lose a lot of their enlisted cyber people. Or if wages go up dramatically in the civilian sector, okay, or continue to outpace the increase in Army wages. Those are the kinds of things that the Army needs to keep a careful eye on as they manage this occupation as it continues to grow.
Let me ask you about. Oh, let me ask you to tilt this way. Yeah, there you go. Um, Before we got started, we were talking a little bit about the economy and its impact on recruiting. Red hot economy, unemployment rates the lowest it's been in a long time. That's been trending downward for almost a decade since the financial collapse. And during the conference in the panel discussion, Commandant Neller sort of made clear that everybody's been pretty much hitting their recruiting and retention goals. Certainly in the Marine Corps and the Navy, and the Coast Guard tends not to have that challenge very much compared with the other services. Let's talk a little bit more specifically from an Army standpoint. Are you concerned that this red hot economy is going to make, even though it's had some dropping, on stock market prices, and we'll see what happens in a couple of years from now, whether or not, this kind of rate of growth can be sustained. But are you concerned about recruiting challenges at a point when folks on the civilian side of that there is, very, very high employment in the civilian world?
I'm always concerned about recruiting and retention challenges, but I'm an economist and we're the dismal science. So, I mean, we're a worried group. That's just the way we are. I would say that what we're starting to see on the civilian side now is we're starting to see some wage growth. Over the last years, wage growth has been modest, particularly if you start to break out the civilian side by sectors, say by education or overall income. You were seeing very low wage growth in the sort of middle and lower areas of the economy. So those with less education, those without graduate degrees, those who are younger. As we're starting to see wage growth in those areas, that's a very positive thing for the civilian economy, of course. But that's the point at which I start to encourage everyone to track retention very closely within the military, and to track recruiting, and to track quality goals too. I mean, the services don't generally miss their overall recruiting goal, but that doesn't mean they have the right combination of people with the right combination of skills to do the jobs that need to be done.
Since you brought in the dismal science, and you are an economist, but even though there is wage growth, you can argue that given wage degradation over the last 25 years or so, the fact that it's increasing doesn't even bring you anywhere close to bringing wage levels up to comparable levels that it would have been, for example, for the same job 20 years ago.
That's true. But if we start to see wage growth, we start to see wages climbing towards where they were before. And I don't think it's a 0-1 type of thing. I don't think there's a point at which I don't think it's the case that recruiting will be not at all difficult and then we hit a specific wage and it becomes incredibly difficult. We're likely to start to see recruiting problems as we see wages go up. It's true that particularly for those in the middle income arena, by many measures, they were better off, a decade or two ago. But it's also true that as young workers look around, they look at the opportunities that they see today in the civilian sector and the opportunities they see today in the military, and they start to weigh those off. I mean, military compensation, has increased substantially, and there are a number of benefits that we're able to offer service members that are not available for civilian workers. But still, as I see civilian wage growth, I think it's worth tracking closely.
Do you think that the parity, or that in some cases military jobs are equal to, and in some cases actually slightly superior to, what you would find in the civilian world, is actually contributing to the veterans' unemployment problem? Because friends of mine, in the military, in leadership positions, have sort of been like, look, I mean, the challenge is, if you're in a certain job in the military, you don't want to leave that and get what was significantly a lesser paying job in the civilian world, as opposed to what the natural order for the military was: we will teach you skills, you won't get paid a lot of money, but then when you get out into the civilian world, you'll be able to, for example, if we teach you how to repair motors or vehicles, you could go out, work for a fleet, or set up your own garage, or do any number of other things. Is that a challenge as far as you're concerned?
It could be. I think there are a number of potential challenges as service members move into the civilian world. What you mentioned, certainly. Many of them, their experiences in the civilian world may not meet their expectations. For whatever reason, they may have gathered, information that's not representative of what will happen to them. But another big issue, I think, and Rand's actually done a fair amount of work on this, another big issue is trying to figure out a civilian job that's a good match for your military skill set. Sometimes it's obvious. If you're a pilot, a good match is probably to be a pilot in the civilian sector. You mentioned truck driver as well. But we have many occupations within the military, say the combat arms-like occupations, that do not have obvious parallels in the civilian world. So at that point, it becomes...
There's no civilian artillery kind
drivers in the civilian world. No, but at that point it becomes the military service member needs to step back and think, so what are my softer skills? Leadership, working on a team, those types of things, helping people in need perhaps, depending on what military occupation we're talking about. And how do those skills match up with civilian jobs? And like I said, we've done some very interesting work here looking at KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and seeing how they match up between military and civilian jobs. And promoting crosswalks, which at least suggest to service members, hey, these are some jobs you might at least consider. These are some jobs you might be interested in. These are some jobs that might use your skill set well. And those might be jobs that the service member had not thought of.
I have so many things I want to ask you, but I know that our time is short. Jennie Wenger, thank you very, very much, Senior Economist here at RAND. Look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you very much.